Hello, everyone. Welcome to the AI skills class. This is our first webinar, and this learning experience is built to take you on an AI learning journey from curious to capable with, at the end, hopefully AI skill badges that you can add to your resume and share with your professional network. Then you're AI credentialed and ready to go on in your AI developer journey. So you're here, you're starting today. We're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for tuning in to our very first webinar. And thank you so much for registering for the AI Skills Quest first edition. You're here and some of the earliest developers to get access to some of our AI learning paths and to take this journey with us. So today we'll be overviewing some beginner basics and some intermediate AI skills for you and doing some live demos. So we'll have an exciting run, which will prepare you to attain the beginner AI skill badge, which we'll link to later. We'll also have a bonus YouTube live intermediate skill badge walkthrough to prepare you for the intermediate skill badge. And your AI skills class mission will be accomplished when you attain both the beginner AI skill badge and the intermediate skill badge. And you'll be ready for the next level in your AI career. Now, we've built this program as a community-based program, and this experience is, best done as part of your community. So don't go alone. Join the Google Cloud community forums now by scanning the QR code that we built here to make sure that you're connected with your community of developers and our product experts who can answer your questions on demand at any time. So if you're not able to join our live Q&A today, you're able to ask questions and spark conversations at any time on the Google Cloud community forums. We built those for you, and we hope that you enjoy them and meet some great connections. Now I'm going to pass it on to our developer relations engineer, Chris Overholt, who will start our exciting presentation today.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Roxanne. I appreciate the introduction, and we are super excited to dig in today to the AI Skills Quest. So I'm Christopher Overholt, and I work in developer relations as a developer advocate. And I work on our AI and ML portfolio, which if you've been looking around for the last couple of years, has been really exciting, all about Gemini and generative models, partner models, Vertex AI. So I am super excited to dig in and talk through some of the skills you'll be learning. And I want to put context around, some of the courses in there. A lot of the folks on my team, along with a whole bunch of other awesome Googlers, put out this content to help you get started developing, help you go deeper in developing. And really, we hope that you come out as a happier developer. We also want you to tell us what works and what doesn't. So this is a great chance to spend time with us. In developer relations, we spend as much or all of our time outside of the Google walls with developers, with customers. So this is a great chance with the Google Cloud community and the AI Skills Quest to dig in to some of these workflows. So the way this is structured is we're gonna kick this off by giving an overview of generative AI and Vertex AI. So you have context. You probably hear about releases related to Gemini, and even I get confused sometimes. Is it Gemini in the Google like Gemini Advanced that I can chat with, or is it in Vertex AI? And so I want to kind of walk through and just frame, like, here's the pieces you should care about while we're going through the Skills Quest courses. Then we'll talk about AI foundations, talk about elevating your AI experience. A lot of times I see beginner and intermediate, and I'm like, what's the difference really? Like, is the code harder to read? But not really. It's a different way of thinking. So we'll talk through what that means as we go from the beginner learning path in section 2 to the intermediate learning path in section 4. Once we get through those, we'll have some cool demos. I'll see if I can break things, which I usually am pretty good at doing. And then we'll get into AI patterns and best practices. And finally, I want to leave you with a goodie bag of learning resources that we put out for developer content for you to, sample code, take it, use it. Don't just read our code, take it, make it your own, and do cool stuff with it. So let's dive in. First thing, I want to talk through the Gemini model and Vertex AI. How do they come together in the big picture? And how do they fit into the skills quest that you'll be looking at? So first, I want to start with what is generative AI? And a lot of there's so many introductory courses. I don't want to give you yet another one, but the real highlights we're seeing from customers and developers is, it's all about creating new content. Personally, for me, like I work in developer relations and we make content, and it's there's a lot of discussion of how much of that will automate my job away. Which I like automating my job myself. I'm an engineer. A lot of us like to automate the boring tasks, but what I really want to talk through today, and I'll show you in some of our examples, is how to use generative AI as an assistant. It's kind of a sounding board for you, generating text, generating images, generating code. And it's nice to have kind of a pair programmer that you don't have to message every few minutes and distract from. And so I'm excited really in Vertex AI when I look at the state of the art models. There's even been some announcements in the last week or so about updates to the Gemini models, updates to partner models. Um, the second part of this is about helping you solve problems faster. If you're like me, you really don't like long iteration times, right? You want quick feedback, quick iterations. And I think that's what this is really enabled. And as we go out of this slide, I think it's interesting to think about new models are always going to come out. What I want to share with you is kind of patterns and practices for using Google as an AI platform and Google Cloud as an AI platform, as opposed to like I can't keep up with all the model releases that are happening. So hopefully we'll demystify a little bit of that. So if we dig into Vertex AI, that's exactly the point I was making. It's Vertex AI is not just it's definitely where the Gemini model is hosted. It's amazing infrastructure and cloud architecture with components all across the board. But it's not just about the Gemini model, it's about an AI platform. And so, what do we mean by AI platform? We mean that we have backend APIs that you can call from a number of different languages like Java, Python, um, JavaScript, things like that, to build out all kinds of apps, whether you're in web or backend or security. But it also means we care a lot about things like quality and evaluation and monitoring. And the mantra has always been, Google is operating these planet scale computers. We want you to have the same tools that you can do that with your generative models, your fine-tuned models, to make your life easier and your job easier with these development cycles. So in the end, like this webinar, we're going to dig into. It's not just chatting with Gemini. It's about architecting the future and how we can build. You can use these building blocks to solve problems one layer at a time. And speaking of, you might have used Gemini in Vertex AI, and I would say for most of this year, or half of this year, Gemini 1.5 Pro has been kind of the de facto model. And I actually like to reflect back. We see all of these technical specs and numbers, but I like to reflect that we've come a long way from the Palm 2 models of last year and even Gemini 1.0 Pro. And when we introduced things like multimodality. So big things I think to keep in mind are the context windows, right? We have 1 million context window and now 2 million context window that's rolling out, or in preview, depending on your location. That's a big deal. There's not a lot of things that surprise me in generative AI, but this one does. I remember much earlier in this year when we were able to roll out the million context window. That's a game changer, right? You don't have to take your documents or videos and cut them up into little pieces and do all of that work. You just send the whole thing. I was even reading a paper recently from DeepMind on Archive that goes into comparing long context versus RAG, and they talked about the quality assessment was slightly higher, about 10% when using long context. So long context is super cool. If you find yourself chunking in the models, like try it. It kind of takes away that whole data preparation part. Just send 10,000 PDFs, send 10,000 images. So that's one. The other one, two other areas in Gemini 1.5 Pro that I particularly find resonate with developers are the multimodality. So being able to send PDFs, being able to send videos without doing all of that pre-processing is super powerful. And the kind of reasoning that Gemini will do about that. And the third area, which is one I work in pretty closely, is function calling and tools and agents. And it's really cool to take something as powerful as Gemini Pro and be able to have it call out to tools and reach out into the world. So, um, always exciting things going on in Gemini 1.5 Pro, and we'll dig into that today and exercise it and kind of give a preview of how you'll interact with it as you go out throughout the courses in the AI Skills Quest. Finally, I am a visual person. I think it's nice to like look at Vertex AI. Where does it fit? You know, there's 200 plus products in Google Cloud, and fitting them all on here would make them tiny and microscopic. But what I like to do is pull out simple flows like this, like why Vertex AI. And folks like me, even though we spend our entire day talking about Vertex AI, we reach out to other really popular services. And a lot of times, if you feel stuck, you know, you're talking to an LLM for hours and hours and trying to solve certain problems, remember that there are other really powerful tools nearby, things like AlloyDB for SQL-like databases, BigQuery for data warehousing, things like Looker, and these all actually work really well together. So you can take this small stack here, plug it together, store your data in BQ, query it with Gemini, build an agent to build cool dashboards in Looker. So I really like to think about this is why Vertex AI, right? It's not just Gemini, it's not just Vertex, but it's all of how it fits into the cloud platform itself. So let's dig in to the beginner learning path. So this webinar is going to focus on two learning paths, kind of one after the other, as you would progress through them yourself. So if you are just getting started or you've been putting off, you know, deep diving with Gemini and Vertex AI, this is a place to start. And then later in the webinar, we'll transition to the intermediate and talk about what that means. So first, let's talk about the beginner learning path. You will get links. You might already have them in your email. I'll give you them in this webinar at the end to the 5 courses that make up this beginner learning path. And instead of just going through and talking about, you know, in the learning path, we talk about LLMs, we talk about responsible AI, talk about prompt design. I thought it would be more motivating to look at a real world example of something and kind of look at what pieces underneath that could involve those attributes or aspects of a generative model like Gemini. So if you have ever looked into like home efficiency, home energy, you know, it's a big topic as we think about sustainability moving forward. You might have thought about, you know, hey, my electric bill's high. You know, it's been really hot this summer. I'm in Texas, so I can vouch to that. In the U.S. here, but it was I was in Germany early this year. It was hot there. We were talking about the weather at different sports events, the Olympics. So when you think about energy analysis, right, you typically think about housing and standards and how they progress over time, and you know, aggregate like what is the use of cities, and can we meet their power demand. So some of you may have like a smart thermostat, maybe a Google Nest, or you might have temperature sensors around your house. You might have something like Home Assistant, which is a cool open source project around, you know, monitoring different parts of your smart home. So let's imagine that we've recorded a bunch of data in our house, you know, for a month, and we want to help other people, you know, think about changes they can make. And if you measure all of this stuff, you know, you can see the impact of upgrading an appliance or applying some kind of energy savings, you know, based on demand and usage. You can think about insulation, things like this. But you always wonder, if I make that change, like it's going to take effort and time, how much return will I get on that? So this is just a very simple, motivating example. Again, instead of walking through the mechanics of LLMs, which is exciting to me, but probably not everybody, I want to talk about a real use case. So think about a house that has a family of 4. They have a monthly energy bill of $300 US dollars, 2,500 square foot house. And, you know, maybe it was built in the 70s or so, has some older appliances and not so good insulation. So they feel it in the summer, they feel it in the winter. Um, I want to walk through in Gemini, like how would we prompt, and we can start super simple with one sentence. and we'll add on to that and see what, if you start with one sentence, you start with an idea, what can you do with prompt design? What can you do with safety? What can you do with responsible AI to kind of build that part out? And I don't want to skip over this part. As a beginner, you're like, okay, I know how to prompt. I want to go to the next part. This is actually really important, because this drives how, your input is going to drive how the generative model responds, and sort of how it's going. Is it going to optimize for efficiency? Is it going to optimize for cost? So you can actually do really important things. And you might have played around with some generative AI tools or apps, and behind the scenes, there's probably a giant prompt optimized for a given use case. And so I want to dig through that. So I'm going to switch over to my demo machine, and there we are going to play a little bit around with some prompting. So I have a tab here so you don't have to watch me typing, that has some preloaded prompts. So let me first orient where we are, how we got here. So I'm in the Google Cloud Console. If you're going through the courses for the AI Skills Quest, you'll see links of like, go here to log into the console, set up a project. So we'll assume you've done that, or if you haven't, the courses will walk you through that process. And so once you're inside of the Google Cloud Console, there's a whole bunch of different products and services. Today, we'll be in the Vertex AI tab. And within that tab, there's a bunch of things you can do. I'm mainly going to be inside of the freeform, the chat, and the vision, like these kinds of generation parts, because that's what you will be focusing on in the first parts of that course. So with all of that out of the way, we have a UI. We have the default here set to Gemini 1.5 Flash. We'll talk a little bit later about Flash and Pro and what that means. But just for now, let's leave everything defaulted. And let's go in and paste a very simple sentence and say, let's assess the energy efficiency of a 2,000 square foot home with a monthly energy bill of $300 USD. So interesting answer, right? So we send a prompt to Gemini. You can also do this in an API. We'll do this in a second, in a later step when we take this to Python code and run through it. Interesting thing here, right? We get a text response, and Gemini is being pretty honest. It's like it's almost impossible or impossible to assess the energy efficiency. There's a lot of variables in that problem, right? So whenever you look at, think like an engineer. Where's the location? Is it generally hot or cold? What's the age of the house? What are the energy costs? What is the source? So there's a lot of variables. And so on one hand, Gemini's, generating text based on the data it's been trained on and its corpus. On the other hand, Gemini does have reasoning abilities, as other generative models, as state-of-the-art models have these days. So it's sort of concluding that, like, I could reason about this, but based on that sentence, I don't have enough information. So you need to think about, if you're passing this on to someone or you're passing this back to a user, think about how to guard for this, right? That's a very small prompt. It's very open-ended. Even if we let the user put in those two variables, they're probably not going to get a very useful answer, right? So this is like version 1 of our prompt. Speaking of versions, you can save prompts, you can save chats. I love doing that, so I don't have to start over every single time. So there's a save button here in case you want to save in version prompts, because I know you can work iteratively towards your golden prompt. Let's give it some more information. So I'm going to paste a little bit larger prompt and say, okay, let's analyze the energy efficiency of a home with these attributes. It's located in Tokyo. It's built in 1995. It's 120 square meters. The monthly bill, I forgot when I was writing this prompt to change the currency to Japanese currency. Gemini will do that for me, which is kind of nice. So I'll leave that as is, but that was my mistake. I've also given it some information in the prompt other than those variables. And I said, give me 3 specific recommendations for improvement, estimate potential savings, and please consider recommendations from these 2 organizations, Environmental Energy Study Institute and the Department of Energy in the US. So you can kind of see this prompt is giving more context to the problem to Gemini. It's, I think of it in my mind as it's kind of weighting what the response is going to do, right? And so is it going to give you exactly 3 recommendations? Maybe, maybe not. It gets smarter every day. You might get 4, you might get 2, but you certainly won't get 100, right? Um, Potential savings, like it may call that out sometimes, it may not, especially if you have the temperature something other than 0 or even at 0. So these are ways to kind of get more consistent responses, and by consistent I mean conversationally consistent, because it is just free text, right? So let's send this prompt and see if we get a more interesting answer. So now Gemini gives us kind of a like free-formed response of, yeah, this home is this house in Japan, older construction. It talks through some challenges. It talks through recommendations, insulation upgrade, window replacement. It has potential savings. So I like having that kind of bounding analysis, and we could think about that, like which project do we want to do first. So there's a lot more context here. Not only did it give these ideas around improvements, but it gave context around, this is your bill now, this is the impact it could have. It's all free form text, so you do need to think about that. And we'll talk about that as we get into the intermediate, tearing out these kinds of responses and templatizing them. But we just added a few more lines, and now the calculation is no longer impossible per Gemini. And we got a lot more context. So that's starting to be a better exchange here. And this is all the ideation phase, right? This is just messing around. We haven't even spun up our Python code editor or Cloud Shell or anything yet. We're just playing around in AI Studio, and that's exactly what it's for. So let's go a step further. And now we say, okay, instead of me just prompting this, um, instead of me prompting this large, unstructured kind of instruction set, let's get a little more detail. Let's put system instructions in. And that way we're kind of templatizing that in the model and saying, these are important. Hang on to this. It's not just me telling you at the beginning of the conversation. It's like me giving you, a piece of paper that says, here are the rules you should follow, right? So we'll take those system instructions, we'll take the prompt below, and now you see we're starting to shift some of the responsibility and say, this is the rule set, let's put that in the system instructions. And then the user really, doesn't, like, a user isn't going to come and say, give me 3 recommendations with percentages, with these standards. Like, we want to build all that into our prompt. So this already has us thinking about how the user experience would be architected and how we can separate that out from the user. So let's copy all of this. Let's go back to Gemini. Let's clear this prompt out. And up here at the top bar, you'll see something called system instructions. And here, this is how the model should respond. So I'll just I'll delete the parts I don't want. I'll grab this prompt for later. And there we go. So system instructions are going to be stored. You can store them. You can think of them as like globally stored as long as you're working in that model session. So I'm going to apply those. And now I can write, you remember the first time we gave the 1-sentence prompt with, this is my bill, this is my, and it said, I can't answer that. Now it has context from the system instructions separate from the input about how to handle this kind of response. And you can literally do whatever you want in there. You can steer this user experience, right? So you're trying to set them to fix up their next home renovation for energy, or if you're just trying to do an energy assessment across the board, like, you get to define the scope. So let's run this prompt. And now we didn't get the Gemini telling us this was impossible, because now it's using the input combined with the system instructions. And it's kind of, printing out a similar assessment as before. So all we did was kind of break up the prompt, the instructions, and it's giving us same thing. And the year is unknown, so it uses that as a variable in its reasoning. And it comes with upgrade the doors and windows, improve the insulation, install smart thermostats. And so we kind of get the same output, and we didn't have to make the user, specify all of that stuff. This is important, though. Think about what you want the user to be able to vary and what you don't, right? So if you have, standards that are applicable to worldwide, or they're for a certain region, like, it's always about the scope of your use case. And I think a lot of end users, you and me, we're developers, but we also use some of these generative apps, and we get frustrated because we're like, oh, this app is really cool, but it's hard coded in the system instructions. It only works in Europe, and I want to run it for an assessment. So do think about, if you have an easy path, you can hide all that away. But if you want users to tweak things, maybe you want to expose some of those variables. So we're already thinking about our architecture of our user experience, which is so nice, because a few years ago we would still be designing a database schema and figuring out where we're going to store blob storage and things like that. So I really, really like this kind of flow. So the very last part I'll show here in the scope of the beginner learning path is, you don't have to stay in the AI Studio in this UI. You can, whenever you're ready, you can take this to the next phase of ideation, which is the code. You can represent everything here: system instructions, settings, everything that you've maneuvered in the UI. You can take to Python code or our other SDKs. So if I click on let me go back and show that real quick. There's a Git code button on the top right. And whether you're in the text modality or like the freeform or chat modality, you click on that and it is going to give you Python, Node, Java, or curl commands to execute that same interaction that you just had. So here, I don't have to like go to the Python tutorial and get the boilerplate and copy and paste things. It does that all for me. So I can take this and I can do a couple of things. I can take this and run it locally on my IDE or a Jupyter notebook. Or if I click this open notebook button, it is going to open a new notebook in Colab Enterprise. And now it is going to bring over all of that information. And so now if I, let me hide some of these to get more room here. There we go. And so now I can instantiate and run this notebook. It's going to activate the runtime and all that fun stuff. And then it's going to replicate exactly the call I just made in the UI, which is pretty cool. And so here I can take this notebook, I can add more libraries, and I'm off to the races, right? So here I get the output programmatically. So I really like to ideate stuff in the AI Studio. It's very visual, it's very fast. I don't have to think about code. I just think about the problem and the user experience. I go to a notebook. Now I have Python code. Now I can install pandas. Now I can install scikit-learn. Now I can install visualization libraries. Like it's just like that. And if I do want to go back to ideate, I can jump back to the studio and do the same. So I find that to be a really useful way to walk through and learn. As you're going through some of the courses, those are patterns that I literally do every day. So I'd love to hear, try it, see what works best for you. Maybe you prefer one or the other. So now with that, we've kind of walked through the prompts. So I'm going to go back to the presentation and we will continue along this beginner journey and kind of debrief about what we just saw and learned, especially when you start to get some of these courses on your own. So let's talk about what just happened. And I like to think about layers, or you can think about the timeline. Just like you have a timeline for learning in the AI Skills Quest, we have kind of this timeline of like, what did we just do? So if we start, we first gave a very simple prompt to Gemini, and that's really just to understand, what is the interaction like? When does Gemini not answer something? What can it answer well? That's just a very good way to get started. Once you do that, you should start thinking about your use case and think about, don't make the scope too big, right? So try to start with a small problem, a small scope. That's where you want to say, okay, how can I augment my prompt? How can I bring system instructions? How can I start to reference? You might start pasting inline recommendations from certain energy standards, right? So prompt design to me is it's an art and a science, but usually what I'm doing is giving more context, focusing the scope, and really optimizing for a given use case. I think as soon as you try to start solving everything at once, things get really hard. So that's prompt design. The other thing about prompt design, it's kind of its own programming language. It's its own DSL. It is a language. It's text, English or Spanish or Italian or French, but there is, how does the model interpret that? How does it tokenize it? So you'll kind of learn as you go along how models behave. Like the more explicit you give instructions of like, return it like this and have this conversational tone, the better. And a lot of times we just assume that the model will behave that way, but let's be explicit and tell it, you should be a helpful customer service agent, or if you're feeling crazy, you say you should answer everything in pirate speak. You can do whatever you want here and play around, and it really just makes you more comfortable with how to interact. And that's what prompt design is, more about the interaction with you in the model than it is about the perfect prompt. So play around. Next, we can think about responsible AI and AI principles. So the way I would think about this, we don't go too deep in the beginner learning path, but there are a couple of courses that I think give a lot of context, because these kind of tools are really powerful and you want to use them responsibly. So whether it's adding pieces to the system instructions or changing some of the safety filter settings in Gemini, again, totally use case dependent, but think about safety, right? Like you want to give safe responses, but also think about if you're giving, for example, the energy recommendations, think about the local codes and the local law and the culture. Like you also want to be respectful of the users, of the community, of the culture. So um, I always kind of think responsible AI, oh, that's safety filters, but it's a lot more than that, right? So think about how not only to depend on the awesome safety filters in Gemini, and you can tweak different types of content, but also think about how to inject that into your own prompts and into your own apps and your own experience. Edge cases help here. You don't have to spend too much time on edge cases, but just come up with a few. Don't ask exactly the same thing. Just come up with some wild ideas and just see what happens, so you can start to bound some of that. And so coming out of the beginner learning path, you can think of this as, again, I really don't like to think about it as mechanics and features. And if you know that Gemini has a million context window and multimodality, that means you're done with the beginner course. I don't think so. I think instead of that, you now have a mental model of, these are the kinds of problems I can solve. This is how I, quote unquote, interact with the model as a programmer, as a developer, whether it's through the UI or through a programming language. But the important thing here is this foundation is super important. And, if you get this right, it is going to pay off a lot when you get to intermediate and advanced problems, because there's going to be all kinds of variables and things changing and layers of your app. So just remember everything here. The AI Skills Quest is that's why I like how they're grouped. You're not just reading through a sample notebook, but you're actually looking through something where we've sat down and said, this should be the curriculum for, introduction to generative AI, LLMs, and so on. And even I go back, almost on a weekly basis, and like, I need to go back and really understand what we mean by tokenization and context window. So don't be afraid to go back in the beginner bin. It's fun. And you get a badge too. I love badges within the AI Skills Quest. So now, normally I would jump directly from beginner to intermediate. I'm not going to do that here. Why? Because I think we very quickly overlook that. I talk a lot with developers, and they say, yeah, what's a level 100 topic? And do you have any level 200 topics you suggest? And that's a really hard question to answer, right? Because everyone learns differently. There's a lot of variables you could go down. You could go way deep with safety filters. You could go way deep with multimodality. So when I think about going from beginner to intermediate, especially how it's framed in the AI Skills Quest, I think about so you have the building blocks to solve specific kind of one turn problems, let's call them, right? So you say, I want to know the energy audit of my house. You can audit it and you get an answer, and then you decide what to do. What if you wanted to do that for your entire neighborhood, house by house? What if you wanted to do that for an entire city? What if you wanted to account for real-time weather? And so we're not just making our problem harder because we like to do that. We're doing that because the real world is very complex. And so when I think about going from beginner to intermediate, you're no longer thinking about one component doing a thing like our prompt example. You're actually thinking about synthesizing things in the real world, and you can't do it all, but Gemini can certainly help you with things like multimodality, being able to take in audio, connecting to other systems, connecting to data sources. So that's what we mean going from beginner to intermediate. And there really is no hard definition, right? You don't have to feel I think just immerse yourself in it, and you just know that we had to pick a bin of whether it went into beginner or intermediate. So The second point I wanted to make about going from beginner to intermediate is design patterns. And so, if most of you on the call, if not all, have developed or are developers and work with code in your preferred language of choice, you've probably come across design patterns. There's books on it all the way back to Java and C and Fortran and so on. So there's Python patterns, JavaScript patterns. When you're designing with generative AI, there are AI design patterns, and they're certainly not, an official record of them, right? But as you're solving these problems, it's good to solve different kinds of problems, and you'll soon realize that, hey, this image modality, like you'll come up with a little toolkit of, I have an image, I want to extract all the details from it, and then do something with that. And that's another tool in your toolbox. You might do the same for video. You might do the same for audio, like transcribing audio with the chirp model or something. As you keep doing this is you becoming intermediate and so on, right? You're getting more experience for different tools for different problems. And then you start to realize that prompt design is not the only and the end, right? There's a lot more to think about, whether it's file inputs and outputs, long-term storage, memory, things like that. So as you go through, build up your toolkit, keep those nearby. Don't start from scratch every time. I'm bad at that. I like to start from scratch, but think about reusable components. That's going to make you a better developer, more engaged with this kind of generative AI patterns, and be able to, new library versions will always come out, but your patterns will grow stronger. And the last part I wanted to say when you're transitioning from beginner to intermediate is break down complex problems. Like I said, this is often the hardest part to do, because you have to sit down, you can back away from the keyboard, get a pencil and paper, and just think through the energy example we gave earlier, or we'll work on a different one in a second. Just break your problem down like an engineer would. So first, you think about, like, you want to dissect these multifaceted outputs, like images or videos. You want to process information in stages. You want to use specialized models and synthesize the output always back to the user. Don't forget that step. Don't just dump them back and say, hey, summarize this. Give specifics and consistency. Otherwise, you get a very open-ended response. Let me give you an example. If you were thinking about our energy assessment problem earlier, we started by giving text like, this is the year it was built, this is the area, the floor area, this is where it's located. Imagine if, and you might have seen a lot of apps like this, or you might have had an idea like this, what if I could do a video walkthrough of my house and give that to Gemini and say, start this remodeling project, right? It would be nice if it would physically do it, but let's get all the way up to the planning part. Think about all the things that you have to do if somebody handed you that video as a human, right? You'd have to review it. You'd have to look through, okay, I estimate when the house was built. It's kind of like a forensic detective exercise, right? Which appliance do they have? What model number is that? And you'd have to look up a lot of manuals. You have to look up the cost of electricity in the area. And so I think a lot of folks are disappointed with generative AI models or apps or development, because they're asking a really hard problem that not even an energy expert could do without having to spend 1,000 hours tearing it apart, right? So always think, I always say, think like a human, act like an agent. And what I mean is, when you're developing this, break it up into tasks and reasoning. And you may stub out a certain part that, let's say for our energy analysis, you may have an appliance and its energy draw, like, maybe it draws 1,000 watts when it's on. You may be tempted to just have Gemini do that. But remember, we have calculators and math tools and things built in. So don't overuse Gen AI. There are really specialized models and things like tools, and I should have put that as a capital T, tools in generative models, like Lang chain tools or Lang graph agents. This starts to get the idea of, I'm going to self-describe a tool, give it to a generative model, and then it's actually going to call out to something else, right? Beyond its content generation and reasoning engine and reasoning layer. And it's just going to call let's say a weather model or something that's been working great for 100 years. Like, let's not throw those things away. Let's use them and actually let the LLM invoke that model, come back with the results, and then assimilate it. So don't forget. So that's another big piece of going to intermediate, I think, is when you're starting to glue together components, you start to glue together patterns, you start to bring in outside sources, and you're not just depending on the generative model like Gemini to do the reasoning of an army of researchers and the math and all of that in one shot. Like that's not a realistic expectation. So that takes us to our next point into our next section on intermediate learning path. So hopefully that was a nice glide into easing into the intermediate, what it means. And in this case, we're going to look at a little bit more complex problem. I'm not going to go too crazy with code, but I want to think through the problem and point you to some solutions. And then within the courses, you can dig in on your own. So, I could go super deep on tools and agents, but maybe not everyone's not interested in that. So I want to kind of give you a few pointers and we'll go from there. So in this use case, let's imagine that you're doing urban planning and you want to plan green spaces, right? So you might want to make use of tops of buildings, tops of parking garages. You may have seen this out in your part of the world. I think it's a super cool way to use these spaces, and it helps with vegetation. It helps with energy savings. And so, you might just be thinking, I'm interested in learning more about this. So you could read about it. You could take a course on it. Or if you're a developer and engineer like us, you're like, I want to build a little app, just for fun, to experiment and see, like, what can I do? What can I learn through, engineering solutions for these kinds of problems. So imagine that you wanted to make a web app where users can plan for urban transformation and they want to plan for green spaces. Um, this is where we go beyond text prompting and we start to get the multimodality and reasoning capabilities of Gemini. So when I think about this problem, I think, well, I could type out all of this, like I'm located at this latitude and longitude, the sun rises at this time, but like there must be better ways of doing that. And so I start to think of, okay, could I and actually wrote a notebook tutorial that does this, of like, if you say what are green spaces around the airports in Germany, that could be used, and your tool could go out, grab a satellite image, um, and kind of assess, like, these are possible areas you might want to look into. You can start to talk with the city government or the state government and get more information about that. So that's kind of cool. But let's start simpler in the intermediate path and say, let's say that I have a satellite image and I want to feed it into the model and have it come out with potential locations that would be good. You need to look into other factors like the solar, how much sun is in the area per day. You can get cool things like that from the Google Maps API. I learned is like you can get back a solar flux map. Lots of cool things. So you'll kind of start to piece together the puzzles and tools to solve this. The other thing that'll happen is, we want to start to think about not just code. We want to think about the user experience, right? Because if you want, you probably have a personal project and it's code that only you know how to run, and that's fine. Or you might be inspired to say, hey, I'm going to put this up on GitHub, or I'm going to share a notebook of this, or maybe even make a web app or an Android app or iOS app. This is where you can start to think about the user interface, right? Like, what do you like about this tool? And I guarantee you, if you optimize for it and use it, other people will like that too. They'll appreciate that you're not just sort of designing something that you're not particularly using. You're trying to solve a problem. You're interested in it. And so I'll jump over and show a quick demo here. I'm not going to go too deep, but let's go back to where we were. And if you remember, we left off at the Python code portion of this problem. So here, we have Python code that will initialize a session with Gemini. This happens to be a chat session. You can do this with the text modality. You can do this with streaming or not. So we have that code block. And the next thing I immediately think of doing is I want to put this in the hands of users. And I don't want to give them a Python notebook. They, as much as they like Python, they might not want to do that. They want to just deal with the problem. So how do you package this kind of stuff up? So I immediately think of web apps, and there are a whole bunch of web apps in the Python world, some from Google, some open source. There are things like Gradio and Streamlit. And so in this example, I'll grab some Streamlit code. And again, this is super high level. We're just playing around at thinking about how we go from that Python code I showed you to a user interface where we can start to ideate on really cool things and work quickly. So Python web frameworks are great for this. In other languages, there are kind of these nice front end layers where you can prototype quickly. So I like to go to that layer next because at some point, I don't want to give someone a notebook and have them install Python and a bunch of packages. I just want to have them use the app, right? So here we're using Streamlit. You could do this. We have a number of examples with Jupyter, Colab, Streamlit. You could use Plotly Dash. You can use Gradio. These are all wonderful libraries. For this one, I took a Streamlit sample app. They have a nice chat template app. And I plugged in that code block from before. And I literally, just for the sake of simplicity in the intermediate, I don't want to overwhelm in the intermediate category. We want to add one thing at a time and see what happens. So here, I just give a very simple instruction: help users plan a community green space. The reason is, I like to see the coupling between this is the Python code that I had, and this is the front end layer. And things like Streamlit and similar Python web frameworks are super light and close to the Python. So you don't have to think too hard and you don't have to debug too hard, which is great when you're coming up with crazy ideas like I like to do. So in this case, there's like 15, 20 lines of Streamlit front end code. There's 10, 20 lines of Gemini code, and they come together. I won't read through this line by line, but let's look at the prompt coming in from the user, and then we send that to Gemini and we render the response back. So really, if I were to pick 5 lines of here that are like the most interesting, or the ones where the intersection between Gemini and our front end web app happens, it's here. Everything else is either just setting up the user interface and the components, or Gemini. So this is where they come together. And if I go to my terminal and run this, or go to like Cloud Shell IDE and run this wherever you like running Python, whether it's your local machine or the cloud, we get a little app like this. And so super cool, like 40 lines of code in one Python script. We do Streamlit run app.py, opens up a tab in our browser, and there we are. And so now this app in 40 lines is certainly not going to go all the way, and we're not going to end up with a green space at the end of this, but it's a starting point. And then we can think of, what do we want to do next? Let's implement the satellite map ingesting. And so here I could say something like, I want to plan a green space around unused land near, like what I said earlier, near airports in Germany. And again, all we've really done is it's Gemini prompt with a very simple system instruction. But I like to start simple. And so that's going to send that prompt to Gemini with the system instructions. And there we could keep adding more things. We could say, make sure the user tells you whether you're planning to build a garden or just foliage. And so here, we get kind of a open-ended response from Gemini, but I wasn't actually looking at this point to make it more complex. I was looking to give it a user interface and a user layer where, even as a developer, like, I want to play around in this, as my input. I don't want to have to think about the Python and typing and all that. And now, I have a web app. I can deploy it. I can deploy it on Cloud Run. I can deploy it on Streamlit Cloud. And I can share this with people and say, hey, go here. Maybe I have a little form that's fill out your location, drop in an image of a satellite map of your area. Or, of course, you can automate that with the Google Maps API. And you kind of make a little experience, right? And so we have a lot of patterns like this in our sample code and sample content. And we'll point you to those at the end of this session. So super simple. I could spend another hour of this live coding and you all probably lose interest. So I'll stop there, but I hope it gave you some ideas of how do you take a very simple front end? How do you integrate Gemini? And once you've done that, that's the hard part, right? Everything else is just add to Gemini, add to your front end app, and go on. And if you graduate from that level even, and you're like, I want to make this a full-blown JavaScript web app, of course you can go from there and take the Python code or the Java code, whatever your language of preference, put that in Cloud run that as your backend API, and build the JavaScript front end. And so I love this kind of graduation path. It gives you plenty of room to have hobby projects versus your side project versus your day job, for prototyping. And that's what we mean when we say beginner to intermediate to advanced. So back to our slides, and then we'll kind of come out of that urban planning example and think about architecture. Like, what did we just do? I don't want to get lost in the code, but think like, what did we do? So we started with the LLM and the prompt design, just like we did in the beginner path. We added an application front end. We thought about how we would add multimodal inputs. So we both need to handle that on the front end side. And of course, these web frameworks, the app frameworks, have built-ins for file upload and display image, display plot. And so it makes it really easy to prototype apps. And by the end of the day, I could have a pretty cool green space planner. So we have multimodal inputs. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about, it's easier to talk about than it is to try to show and benchmark here, is Gemini Pro, Gemini Flash. You may have heard these. You may have heard of other variants of Gemini. You may have heard of Gemma, 2B or 7B or 9B. All this means is I like to think about Gemini Pro, Gemini Flash. So if I send a satellite map and a prompt about potential green space issues to Gemini Pro, let's say, just making this up, let's say it takes 10 seconds to come back with an answer. And that has a certain cost associated with it per API call. There's Gemini Flash, which optimizes for speed of the response and cost, which, depending on how much you care about things, or as you grow out of the innovation stage into the production stage, those things become a little bit more important when you have thousands or millions of users using your app. So the way I think about Pro and Flash is Pro, the 10-second example, maybe I try that same image and text prompt, and maybe Flash comes back in 3 seconds or 5 seconds. So I have savings on the time and also savings on the cost. Usually, if you read through the white papers and pricing, it's usually like a 7 to 10 times reduction in speed and or cost. So take a look at that. The way I recommend thinking about that, and especially in the intermediate layer, is use Pro when you're prototyping, because then you know the full capabilities of the model. Once you've gotten to the point where you have a pipeline and you're like, I have this one part in the middle where it just summarizes something or cleans JSON or something like that, you can use Gemini Flash for that specific task. So I think of it as an optimization, but you may be doing other things. You may need real-time interaction. You may need sub-second responses. So that's what Flash is intended to do. So try that out while you're prototyping things. So as we come out of the intermediate path, some key learnings, we've gone beyond a simple, like everything's in the prompt, and we started to componentize and break our application and problem into components. You're now plugging into other systems. Maybe you plug into BigQuery, maybe you plug into Google Cloud Storage. And so that's what I think it means about intermediate level. It's not that you're programming this really hard to read code. It's just that you're solving harder problems and trying to do it as cleanly and maintainable as possible. So with that, let me run through some best practices. And this is a moment where, like, things I've learned along the way, mostly from you all, from developers working with me, telling me, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. Let me reflect that back to everyone. So 3 tips here. Some of these will sound familiar to you, some won't. And I want to frame them in the context of generative AI. Iterate, 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 right? Start small and iterate. I see people trying to solve really big problems and they get frustrated with the model quality, whatever model it is. They get frustrated with the response times. They get frustrated with having to parse output. So start small. Imagine that you're trying to teach your friend something new. You need to teach them context. You need to teach them steps, and you need to teach them how to reason through things. So do the same thing with Gemini, and I guarantee you'll be better friends as you work together with API calls. Another one is fueling Gemini with quality data sources. Um, if you are, planning to jump into the intermediate learning path and you've built a retrieval augmented generation pipeline before, or the RAG implementation, basically, if you've built something with a generative model, reaches out to a web search, or it reaches out to a vector database to retrieve documents, now you're thinking at the level of like, there's no way a generative model trained on general knowledge can answer specific questions. I need to reach out. So think about the data sources you're reaching out to. On one hand, it's really easy to spin up a data store in Vertex AI Search and throw 10,000 PDFs and have like that works really well. Also, make an API call to a weather API, right? Like you can call to a Google spreadsheet. Um, these are all nice ways to have your model become really smart. You just point it to a document you wrote and like, boom, you don't have to fine tune anything. And so those are a nice way to think about what data sources does your model have access to. The last but not least point for sure is evaluation and quality. So as you're building these apps, as you're building these experiences, define metrics that matter. I see developers struggling with like, it's not giving good answers, and how are you measuring that? Well, it just doesn't look good, right? And so you really need to get precise about quantitative metrics. You should certainly measure quality, and you can define that however you want, but also think about relevancy, also think about coherence, think about, if I actually did this, renovation project, would it work, or would it be a year worth of extra work? User testing, super important. Google's big on that, as you know. Test users early. Take it to someone who's not immersed in this problem, and you'll learn 2 or 3 things really quickly that you'll run back and fix right away. Apply AI principles. Remember, these are very powerful tools. Think about guardrails, think about bias, think about fairness, think of someone in another country or someone of another age, someone of another ability using this. What might be important to them? And monitoring. Track this over time, because if you make changes, you say, man, last week it was working great. What have I done? It's really hard to, you probably changed prompts and settings and languages and apps, like monitor. So, oh, I see. Last Saturday, it started going weird when I tried a crazy idea on the weekend. So evaluation is super important. There's things in Vertex AI, like the Rapid Eval SDK, where you can do stuff like that, or just get a number and track it. Any of that is very welcome. So as we wind down out of our journey through the beginner and intermediate learning path, I would like to leave you with some learning resources. I'll give you a preview of what you're going to look at. You're going to look through the beginner learning path. You're going to look through the intermediate learning path in the scope of this webinar and this group. And you'll see things like prompt design in Vertex AI. You'll see things like Gen AI apps with Gemini and Streamlit. And if you're in a certain role, like a data scientist or cloud architect, you'll see Gemini for your role. And that's really about, using the Gemini assistant in various places in Google Workspace, and so to work better. So you'll see courses like this. They're great places to start. Hopefully I hit on some, prompt design, Streamlit, a little bit of data science teasers in there that you say, oh yeah, I remember that in the webinar. We talked about that. I want to do that one. Use these as starting points, and then kind of choose your own adventure. And we've set up the skills quests like that. So here is the care package that I promised you. 3 QR codes, 3 links. So if you scan the QR code, scan them all, take a picture. We're going to send these links out through email communications as well. So if you don't see it here, if you don't grab it here, that's okay. But what you're seeing is the left is the beginner skills quest collection of courses. And you look through it and you'll say, oh, that's why we covered that in the webinar, right? We covered topics relevant to that. Start there. Or if you need a refresher, go back to it. I do it, every so often, every few months, I got to go back and do a refresher because everything's changed. Intermediate is where you can go if you're ready to upskill. That's where you'll find things like Streamlit and adding functionality to existing apps. So I hope you have fun doing that. And the last one is the AI Skills Quest Community Forum. I very much invite you to go there. We have Googlers in there, we have developer relations in there, and more importantly, the community there, developers like you, and we love interacting with you. We love live events, and we're not there with you live. We'll see you in the community forums. So with that, thank you so much for your time. I believe Roxanne is going to come back on with us to thank you all and to queue up our question and answer section. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in for the first webinar of AI Skills Quest. We are so excited that you're here, so excited that you've dived into the content. And what we've showed already in these demos and in this information is a ton of really great resources to prepare you for the skill badges as part of this program. So it should be not that hard of a lift to obtain these credentials and start adding AI to your resume. So we're gonna move into Q&A. So I'm gonna put my thinking
Yeah,
cap
absolutely.
on. I
Oh,
think Chris has one to match, which is pretty great.
Eddie,
And I
that
wanted
what
to
that's an excellent idea. I'm gonna get mine, and I think between you and I, we'll be able to work through this Q&A together. So
are
thank
we
you.
the same
We're matching shirts,
person?
matching hats. Like this is how we collaborate planet scale at Google. So I love it.
Amazing. So the first thing I'm gonna just cover really quickly is we have some questions coming in about how to access all the information for this program and get the emails. The link to the registration for AI Skills Quest is in the chat. So please register for AI Skills Quest if you haven't already. So you are tracked through our system and we can send you the emails and we know who you are. If you're registered and you haven't received an email yet, be sure that your news and announcements is checked for the Innovators Program so that we can send you all of the information for this program. That link should also be in the chat. And if you have any further questions, we also have our Innovators alias. So feel free to send questions to the Innovators email if you are still having any trouble there. But we're gonna because we're over a little bit on time, we'll probably
Yeah.
take the top like 2 to 3 questions here.
Okay. Yeah,
Um,
and you know what? Normally I go into great detail here, but like these are such sharp questions that let's go through rapid fire, and I think I can still give some sharp answers, and that way, I don't waste too much time answering and talking too much. So let's do it, Roxanne. I'm ready to rock and roll through these questions.
Awesome, sounds great. So the first one that we have is that between the Python notebook, Streamlit, and the Gemini API, it feels like a lot to learn. Is there a standard tool chain that Vertex AI users should focus on first? And I think that we have some learning paths for you if you've got that.
Absolutely. I love that question. I have been working in data science and ML and AI and all the acronyms for like 15 years now. And I still get overwhelmed by the amount of tools that are coming out and that even ones I haven't got around to. It's been 5 years. I'm like, I really want to use that thing. So, what I would say is, you can always back away from these tools. You don't have to use the latest cool tool. Python has been around since the late 90s, and it fundamentally is still very similar. So Python is a great glue language that just you can do a UI, you can do a call to Gemini, you can parse code, you can parse an image. So Python definitely on the short list. Um, Tools like Gemini and the Gemini API, I like to have little code snippets that are reusable, and I just stick with those, right? Like I have known things, and that way I don't have to go through that every single time. Um, Web apps, I like so if you think back to how I walked through the app development process, we started in the UI, and then we went to a Colab notebook, and then we went into a web app. From there, you could go to a Cloud Run backend. So I would just say, rather than a list of tools, think about what you want to do. Do you want to prototype all day and share it with your data science colleagues, Python and notebooks? Do you want to expose web apps and start a business with them, right? Like learn mobile. So kind of pick what you're trying to do, what your target audience is, meet them where they are. Don't make folks that, want to hack on Home Assistant work with your random app framework. Um, Go into open source. And so I would just make a very short list of like, here's the 3 things I want to do: prototype rapidly, make Android apps, and then boom, that'll kind of line you up. And then just go use what has the most users, because when you Google for the answer, you'll find it, and you won't find just one result of someone from 10 years ago. So that would be my recommendation: is ignore the tools and just think about what are you trying to do and how do you do it better.
Awesome advice, Chris. The next one that we have here is, are there any differences between crafting these prompts in the console or using AI Studio?
That is a really interesting question for two reasons. So, two quick answers. Number one, crafting a prompt in Vertex AI Studio versus sending it through a Python API or sorry, through the Python SDK or the Java SDK, exactly the same. So there's no difference. And in fact, when you click the button to get the code, whether you go to a notebook or copy it, everything, all the parameters are like, that's all captured in there. So that's exactly the same. You're calling the same API through the UI or through your SDK of choice. However, be careful because aistudio.google.com is different than Vertex AI. And I am in DevRel and I'm as frustrated as you are with the naming. And I'm sorry, everything's called Gemini. But what I would say is that we have Gemini Advanced, the chat app, if you will. And then we have AI Studio, which is by Core ML at Google. And then we have Gemini in Vertex AI. What's the difference? Why do we have all these? Very simple: consumers, developers, enterprise. So find that you're in the right tier. So that question has two answers. And I'll say it one more time so it's super clear. If you're using Vertex AI, no difference between the UI and a Python client and Java. If you're using AI Studio, Google, whatever the URL that they put there, versus Vertex, those are different services with different data governance and so on. So be sure that you're in the right Gemini. There's a lot of Geminis. Yep.
Gemini overload. The next question that we have is, can I get this code? And I can answer that, yes.
I love it. That's a quick answer. And in fact, I was just looking in the sub forum that I linked to. There's a really nice bar on top, and it has a link to our GitHub repository. It has a link to the Skills Quest courses that have links to the code. So yes, everything I showed, you can pull the Streamlit app, and you can find that either in the course when you take it, or if you just want to see all the code, there's a button on the top of the subforums that'll take you to our GitHub repo that my team works on for AI ML samples. I think we're at 130 notebooks. So take them all, steal them all, use them to get a promotion, use them to get more customers. Like, we absolutely want you to take and use that stuff.
Awesome.
Oh, you know what? There's a question in here that is not about Gemini, not about code. It's about skill badges. I wonder if you can help. Roxanne, how much overlap is there between the modules and badges for this Google Cloud Innovator Learning Path and the Google Startup School? Is there any synergy there or connection?
Absolutely. So on the AI Startup School, it's a little bit more geared towards businesses and towards startups, people starting up a business. And we're going to teach you about those enterprise use cases of a lot of our Google Cloud products. So this program specifically is for you guys, the individual devs, and we're really trying to ramp you up on our AI learning paths. So these, two learning paths that we've curated are really great intros into Google Cloud products without dumbing it down too much, so the devs, are able to really integrate and get into the console for these learning paths. So we've got 2 skill badges for you to sort of get those credentials in AI and get AI on your resume. So we're a little bit more individual focused, and if you're building a startup, then feel free to take both and get ramped up in the product suite. I think that'll be a good choice for you over achievers out there.
That's awesome. I love the context, and I especially love the coordination. Google's a big place, and that coordination is not hard. So thank you and the team and Startup School and all that for making that easier. And we're always working to bring the groups together. So thank you for the question. I think we have time for 2 more questions. I see a couple more, one on BigQuery, one on Gemini. Want to fire
Sure
those off?
thing. Yeah, let me read off this question here. We've got, can BigQuery be used as a vector DB, or is it not mandatory to use vector DB for a RAG?
Oh, I love this question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love this question. I'm going to give a short answer. It's really hard, but I promise I'll give a short answer. We have talks on this. We have notebooks on this. We have blog posts on this, webinars just on that question. Short answer. Yes, you can use BigQuery as a vector database. In the world that we live in, there are like 5 or 10 or more ways you can use databases in Google Cloud as a vector database. So people complain, and I think, oh, I like options. It does mean you should evaluate them, but like if you're already using VQ, you absolutely use it to store and serve embeddings, and it's really good at it. So if you're already using VQ, I would highly suggest looking into that. If you're not, and you're using a vector DB in another like Alloy DB or um, uh, any of the other flavors we have, Vertex AI Search, stick with that. But yes, you can. To the second part of your question, is it mandatory to use VectorDB for RAG? I love this question. I spent the last 12 months thinking about this, and a lot of our team has been thinking about beyond RAG. And I think last year we said, like, you have to have if it's a RAG, you must have a VectorDB. I've since dropped that definition. Like, we're not there yet. And I instead say a RAG is any source of information that you're augmenting to the model. So remember, a RAG is, let me grab relevant information, and then second, let me assimilate it into my response. And so you could do that with an API call to a weather prediction endpoint. You could do that to a vector database. You could do that with a Google web search with grounding. So I call all of those RAGs. And if that gets me in trouble, I'm sorry, but I just think it's so cool that I don't want people to get hung up on vector databases. Just like, call the external system you have. Don't, I've seen people do crazy things, take Google Drive, put it into embeddings, or like, no, just call the Google Drive Search API. Love that question. Thank you for that.
The rag police are coming for you.
That's right. That's right. I'm concerned now. Yes, it's
Well,
real.
we'll do one final question here. Does Gemini have access to the latest content on the internet, unlike other LLMs?
Fantastic question. Again, I'll give a short answer. We have a lot of documentation on this. That would actually, that would be a great forum post too, because there's actually, depending on which Gemini you're using. So short answer, if you're using the Gemini API in Vertex AI, it is not reaching out to the internet unless you tell it to with grounding in Google search, grounding in Vertex AI search. That's by design. So if you're an enterprise company, we had other questions we couldn't get to, I apologize, about confidentiality and data regulations and things. Like, Vertex AI is all about that. We have, all different compliance and industries that we serve. So that's intentional. That being said, we have a ton of services and products that can, the easiest one I think of is grounding in Google search. If you add that code in, then yes, your Gemini calls in your application there will be called. So it's up to you to architect that. If you're using other products that have Gemini in their name, like the chat assistant or Gemini on your phone or Gemini in the AI studio for Google developers, some of those may have backend processes that are like, oh, you've asked that, and you may see this in Gemini Advanced or Gemini where it has extensions, and it says, I'm looking up this on a map, and I'm looking up on that. And so in those products, those are consumer products. So we just say, hey, do you want to turn on extensions, and we'll search flights for you and prices. In Vertex AI, you would need to intentionally say, like, for my customers, I want to call out to the web here. You have full control. So that's the difference, and hopefully you understand why, the enterprise versus consumer. But excellent question, because I feel like we're chatting with chatbots all the day and we have no idea, are they connected to the internet? Are they not? Is it telling me that it doesn't know? Does it know? It's very confusing. So it's very good to be explicit about that. I'm glad you asked. So
100%.
cool.
Thank you so much, everyone. That'll be the end of our program again. Like, thank you so much for all the great and insightful questions, and for turn our brains off.
Yeah, Q&A is over. I don't know. It's, if you wear it too long, it starts to melt brain cells, so
Very true.
we gotta ease it out of it. So thank you, Roxanne. That was fantastic. I just want to say thank you to everyone for your time, for joining us, and mostly for being awesome developers. We'd love to hear your feedback on GitHub, on Stack Overflow, and most importantly, the Google Cloud Community forums. We want feedback, good, bad. We want product feedback. We want to know what's working for you. We're there with you. We're on your side. We're developer advocates. We feel the same pain you do, but I really do appreciate you all taking the time here. And I hope this gets you excited for the Skills Quest and the courses that we put out there. Yep. And Roxanne, you want to take us out?
100%. Yeah. And again, please interact in the Google Cloud Community forums. Please, go out there and start skilling up with your skill badges that are accessible to you, again, at no cost as part of your innovators program. So as AI innovators, we're so excited to have you and so excited to have you as part of the program. This will be, really, really exciting opportunity for everybody to get skilled up in AI and for us to bring, a lot more devs into our products to start using Gemini for everything and anything. So thanks so much. And we're so excited to see what you build.